Jake Matthews was just another cowboy, riding alone through the vast empty desert of Arizona. It was late in the day and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dry earth. The heat of the day was beginning to fade, but the desert was far from peaceful. The wind, always strong in these parts, began to pick up, sending small clouds of dust swirling into the air. It was the kind of place where, if you weren't careful, the desert could swallow you whole without a trace. Jake wasn't new to this landscape. He had spent most of his life out in the wild, working on cattle ranches, riding from town to town, never staying in one place too long. His horse, Dusty, was a steady companion, used to the harsh conditions as much as Jake was. They had been through their fair share of tough times, and as the two of them moved across the desert, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were both survivors, but on this day things felt different. The silence of the desert seemed more oppressive, as if it was hiding something. Jake had been riding for hours, trying to cover some ground before the sun completely disappeared. His thoughts wandered as Dusty's hooves pounded along the dry trail, the rhythmic sound of their movement the only thing breaking the quiet. He thought about the small town of Tucson, not far from where he was. He had planned to stop there, buy some supplies, maybe get a drink at the local saloon. But now the town seemed far away. It was then that Jake heard it, a faint sound, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. At first he wasn't sure if it was real. The desert had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially when you were out there alone for too long. But as he rode closer, the sound became clearer. It was a voice, a cry for help. The desperation in the sound hit him immediately. Without thinking, Jake turned Dusty in the direction of the cry, urging his horse to pick up the pace. The wind was starting to howl again, but Jake could still hear the faint cries over the noise. His heart began to race and his mind worked quickly. Who could be out here in the desert, this far from civilization? The thought of someone stranded or worse left behind made his stomach turn. He spurred Dusty on, the horse moving faster as they closed in on the source of the cry. After a few more minutes of riding, they reached the base of a jagged cliff. The terrain here was rocky, and the path narrow. Jake slowed Dusty down, scanning the area carefully. It was then that he saw her, a woman lying on the ground, barely moving. She was dressed in worn, tattered clothes, and her dark hair was tangled around her face. Her skin was pale and her eyes were closed as if she had lost all hope. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He dismounted quickly, rushing over to her side. As he knelt down, he could see that she was badly injured. Her body was covered in dust and blood, and her breath came in shallow, labored gasps. He gently lifted her head, his fingers brushing against her forehead. She was burning with fever. "What happened to you?" Jake muttered, more to himself than to her. But the woman didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, locking onto Jake's face with a look of confusion and fear. She was clearly scared, and she didn't seem to recognize him. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, just another weak cry for help. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't leave her here. The desert was too unforgiving. He had seen too many people fall to its mercy, and he wasn't about to let this woman suffer like that. Without hesitating, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, gently tipping it toward her lips. She drank eagerly, her throat convulsing as she tried to swallow. But her strength was clearly fading. As she drank, Jake glanced around. There was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no campfire, nothing. How had she ended up out here all alone? He couldn't tell. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she needed help, and Jake wasn't the type of man to walk away from someone in need, especially not out here. "Hang on, miss," Jake said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm gonna get you out of here." The woman's eyes widened, and for the briefest of moments she seemed to relax. But then, as if the reality of her situation had hit her all over again, her face twisted with fear. She weakly grabbed Jake's sleeve, pulling herself closer to him. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said something Jake couldn't quite understand. Her words were mixed with pain and panic, but one thing was clear: she was terrified. "Don't leave me or I'll die," she gasped, her hand trembling as it gripped his arm. Jake's heart clenched. He could feel the weight of her fear, the raw desperation in her voice. He wasn't sure who she was or why she was out here, but one thing was certain: if he didn't help her, she wouldn't survive the night. He looked down at her, his mind working quickly. The night was falling fast, and the desert wasn't a place for anyone to be alone after dark. The temperature would drop, and without shelter, the woman's chances of making it through the night were slim. He needed to act fast. Without wasting another second, Jake hoisted the woman onto his horse. She barely weighed anything, and he could feel her frailty as he lifted her up. She let out a small pained moan, but didn't protest. Her body was limp in his arms, and her grip on his sleeve had loosened. "Don't worry, miss," Jake said again, his voice steady. "I won't leave you." With that, he climbed back onto Dusty, carefully holding the woman in place. He nudged the horse forward, leading them into the night. The stars were beginning to twinkle overhead, and Jake's thoughts turned to the long journey ahead. He didn't know how he was going to get her to safety, but one thing was certain: he wasn't about to leave her to die in the desert. As Dusty moved forward, the wind howled louder and the desert seemed to close in around them. The night was dark and full of uncertainty, but Jake was determined. He knew the journey ahead would be dangerous, but it was a risk he had to take. For the woman in his arms, he would brave the desert's wrath. No matter what it took, he wouldn't let her die out here. The night stretched on, but Jake didn't stop. The moonlight shone dimly across the barren landscape as they rode deeper into the desert, far from civilization, but closer to the unknown. The only sounds were the rhythmic hoofbeats of Dusty's steady steps and the faint, desperate breaths of the woman he was trying to save. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead as Dusty moved steadily through the desert. The air had cooled a little, but the night was still harsh and the wind bit through the fabric of his jacket. The woman he had rescued, still unconscious and weak, rested her head against him, her small, fragile body pressed against his side. He could feel her shivering despite the thick blanket he had wrapped around her. Jake glanced down at her, concern furrowing his brow. She hadn't said much since he'd found her, just weakly murmured a few words that he hadn't been able to understand. Her breathing was steady but faint, and she didn't seem to have the strength to open her eyes for more than a few seconds. It was clear she was in bad shape. The fever had taken a toll on her, and she needed help fast if she was going to survive the desert's harsh conditions. But Jake wasn't sure how much help he could provide. He wasn't a doctor, he was just a cowboy who knew how to survive in the wilderness. The thought of trying to get her to a town seemed impossible. He didn't know how far the next settlement was, or even if they would be able to find it before morning, but he wasn't going to leave her to die. He had made a promise to himself and to her that he wouldn't let that happen. As the hours passed, the desert night became colder. The wind picked up again, howling through the vast emptiness, and Jake could feel the chill seeping through his own clothes. His horse Dusty seemed as tired as he was, moving slower now, as if the long journey had worn him down as well. Jake patted Dusty's neck, giving him a few encouraging words. "Hang in there, old boy. We're almost through this." The woman stirred slightly in his arms. She had been so still for the longest time that Jake had begun to worry she might not wake up. Her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, and she gazed up at him with a mix of confusion and fear. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked like she was about to say something, but her strength failed her. Her body slumped even more against Jake's chest, and he could feel her breathing slow. Jake shifted in his saddle, adjusting his hold on her so that she wouldn't fall. He wished he could do more for her, but there wasn't much he could offer out here. He had no medicine, no real shelter. He had nothing but the promise he'd made to her and the will to survive. And for now, that had to be enough. "Don't give up on me, miss," Jake said softly, his voice a mixture of hope and concern. He wasn't sure if she could even hear him, but it was all he had. He needed her to keep fighting. As the night wore on, Jake's thoughts drifted back to his own life. He had always been alone, at least that's what he told himself. The life of a cowboy wasn't exactly one that encouraged close relationships. Most of the time he moved from one place to the next, never staying anywhere too long. He had friends, sure, but they weren't the type of friends who would stick around for long. Everyone knew that the life of a cowboy was hard, and sooner or later everyone parted ways. But something about this woman, about her situation, made him feel different. He couldn't quite explain it, but the thought of leaving her out here in the desert, abandoned and alone, didn't sit well with him. The desert was unforgiving, and if she was left here, her chances of surviving were slim. He couldn't let that happen. As the hours stretched on, the woman, who still hadn't said her name, became more restless. She would groan softly now and then, her head turning from side to side as if she was caught in some sort of painful dream. She hadn't spoken much, but Jake could tell that she was struggling with something. Fear? Pain? Loneliness? He couldn't say for sure, but it was clear she wasn't at peace. After a while, she shifted again, and this time her eyes opened fully. This time they were clearer, focused. She stared up at Jake for a long moment, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and something else. Maybe gratitude, maybe fear. Where are we going? Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was enough for Jake to hear. Jake hesitated, unsure of how to explain their situation. The truth was, he wasn't sure where they were going either. His only plan had been to get her away from the dangerous desert, but as the hours passed, that plan seemed less and less certain. "We're heading toward a town," he said after a moment, trying to sound reassuring. "I'll get you somewhere safe." The woman's gaze softened slightly, though her face still held the marks of pain. She let out a small sigh and closed her eyes again, as if accepting Jake's words. It wasn't much, but it was a small step in the right direction. At least now she knew he wasn't going to leave her out there alone. Jake continued riding through the night, the wind picking up and dust swirling around them. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for this woman. He didn't know who she was or why she had been left behind in the desert, but he felt a connection to her, something beyond just the fact that he had saved her life. It was as if he had been given a chance to do something good, something that mattered. Every now and then the woman would stir in his arms, but for the most part she remained silent, her eyes closed as if she was conserving her strength. Jake couldn't help but feel a little nervous. The desert was unpredictable, and it seemed like they were running out of time. The longer they stayed out here, the harder it would be to make it to safety. He needed to keep moving, but it wasn't easy. He had to be cautious, keep his wits about him. One wrong move and they could both end up lost. "Just a little longer," Jake muttered to himself, encouraging Dusty as they moved forward. The horse seemed to understand, picking up the pace ever so slightly. Hours passed, and with each one the desert became more haunting. The cold night air was bitter, and Jake could see his breath hanging in the air in front of him. It was hard to imagine how anyone could survive in such a place, especially without shelter, food, or water. Jake's mind wandered back to the woman he carried. He still didn't know her name, and he wasn't sure how much longer she would last like this. The fear of losing her haunted him, but he kept telling himself that he had to try no matter what. He wasn't going to let the desert claim her. Finally, just as he was beginning to wonder how much longer he could keep going, he spotted something in the distance. Through the haze of the wind and dust, a faint silhouette appeared. Buildings. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of civilization. Jake felt a surge of relief. It wasn't a town yet, but it was a start. He spurred Dusty on, urging the horse toward the lights in the distance. The woman stirred again in his arms, and for the first time in hours, Jake thought he saw a hint of awareness in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. The journey through the desert continued into the early morning hours. The cold night air had begun to bite at Jake's skin, but he kept his focus on the path ahead. Dusty, his trusty horse, was growing tired, and so was Jake. The night had been long, and the strain of carrying the woman, the mysterious Apache woman, was beginning to wear on him. She had remained mostly unconscious in his arms, only stirring occasionally, but each time she did, Jake's heart tightened with fear. He could feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him more with each passing moment. The flickering lights in the distance that Jake had seen earlier were now closer, clearer. They were coming from a small settlement, a few scattered houses and a general store on the edge of the desert. Jake couldn't be sure if it was a safe place, but it was their only hope at this point. He urged Dusty forward, willing the horse to carry them just a little further. The wind had died down a bit, and the silence of the desert seemed almost eerie now. The only sound was the rhythmic clip-clop of Dusty's hooves on the rocky ground and the soft rustling of Jake's coat as he shifted to keep the woman steady in his arms. He glanced down at her, his eyes scanning her fragile face. She was still pale, her eyes closed, and she appeared to be barely holding on to consciousness. Jake had no idea who she was. She was clearly Apache, her features sharp and strong yet soft in their own way. Her long dark hair, tangled from the days of exposure, framed her face, and her clothes were torn and weathered from the harsh desert conditions. Jake had found her lying alone in the wilderness, abandoned by whatever tribe or people she had been with. But why had they left her? What had happened to her, and why had no one else come to her rescue? He didn't have the answers to those questions, but in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was getting her somewhere safe. As the settlement came into view, Jake felt a sense of relief that he hadn't realized he needed. The buildings were small and modest, the streets empty, but there was something comforting about the sight of civilization. The only problem was that Jake wasn't sure how the people in this settlement would react. He had heard whispers of tension between the settlers and the Apache, and he wasn't certain how the people here would respond to an Apache woman in his arms. "Stay with me." "Miss," Jake murmured, his voice soft and steady. "We're almost there." She didn't respond. Her body was warm against his chest, but her breathing was still shallow, and her grip on him was weak. Jake wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. The desert had already taken so much out of her, and there was still more to go. They reached the edge of the settlement just as the first light of dawn began to break across the horizon. The buildings were simple, made of wood and stone, with little to distinguish them from one another. The air smelled of earth, dust, and the faint hint of smoke from a nearby campfire. Jake spotted a small structure, a general store at the far end of the settlement. It was the only building that seemed to have any activity around it. Jake urged Dusty toward the store, hoping to find someone who could help. As they approached, a few figures appeared at the edge of the building. They were settlers, a man and a woman dressed in simple clothes. The man was the first to notice Jake and the woman in his arms. His face immediately changed from casual curiosity to suspicion. "Hey there," the man called out as Jake approached, his tone sharp. "What do you think you're doing with her?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had expected some sort of reaction like this, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. The woman in his arms was Apache, and that fact could make things difficult. He didn't know how these people would react, but he had no choice but to try. "She's hurt," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "She needs help." The man eyed him for a moment, his gaze shifting to the woman Jake was holding. The woman in his arms stirred slightly, but she didn't wake. The man looked back at Jake, his expression still filled with doubt. "Where'd you find her?" the man asked, his tone softer but still wary. "In the desert," Jake said. "She was left out there. She won't survive if we don't help her." The woman standing next to the man took a step forward, her expression softening as she looked at the unconscious woman in Jake's arms. She didn't speak immediately, but nodded in understanding. "You better bring her inside," the woman said quietly. "We'll take care of her." Jake let out a sigh of relief. He had expected hostility, maybe even rejection, but this woman seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He nodded gratefully and urged Dusty toward the small porch of the store. The man stepped aside, still watching Jake with an unreadable look, but he didn't stop him. Jake dismounted carefully, making sure the woman didn't fall. The woman led him inside, and Jake followed, careful not to jostle the woman too much. The inside of the building was small but tidy, with shelves filled with canned goods, blankets, and other supplies. A fire crackled in the small hearth at the back of the room, and Jake felt the warmth as they stepped inside. The woman gestured for Jake to lay the Apache woman down on a cot near the fire. Jake did so gently, being careful not to hurt her. As soon as she was settled, the woman began to tend to her. She moved quickly, pulling a few things from the shelves, including clean bandages and herbs that Jake didn't recognize. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice full of gratitude. "I didn't know where else to go." The woman gave him a nod, but she didn't speak right away. She was focused on the woman's condition, carefully cleaning and dressing the wounds on her body. She seemed to know what she was doing, which gave Jake some comfort. "She's in bad shape," the woman said after a while, looking up at Jake. "But she'll survive. We need to keep her warm and she needs water." Jake nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief wash over him. They had made it. They had reached safety. The woman's life was no longer in immediate danger, and Jake had done what he could to help her. He stood by quietly, watching as the woman worked. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time since he had found the Apache woman in the desert, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. They were safe, at least for now. As the woman continued to tend to the Apache woman, Jake stepped outside for a moment to give them some space. He stood on the porch gazing out over the desert that stretched out before him. The sun was rising higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. It was a beautiful sight, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that hung over him. There was still so much he didn't know, about the woman he had rescued, about her people, and about what would happen next. But for the moment, none of that mattered. The woman was safe, and so was he. And that was enough. For now, at least. The morning sun had begun to rise higher in the sky, casting a soft golden light into the small room where Jake and the woman lay. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the silence, and Jake stood quietly in the corner, keeping a careful eye on the Apache woman as she slowly began to stir. Her breathing had steadied, and the fever that had once burned so hotly seemed to have calmed. Jake couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. She was alive, and that was more than he had expected when he had first found her, broken and alone in the desert. But as he watched her, he knew that this was only the beginning. She was still weak, far from recovered, and there was no telling what would happen next. The road ahead for her was uncertain, and so was the road ahead for him. He had done what he could, but now it was out of his hands. He needed to know more about her, and perhaps more importantly, what to do next. The woman who had helped them, the one who had brought them into her home and offered shelter, moved quietly around the room, preparing some sort of medicine that smelled strong and bitter. She was humming softly to herself as she worked, as though it were the most normal thing in the world to take in an injured stranger and tend to their wounds. Jake admired her calmness in the face of such uncertainty. He was still on edge, his mind racing with questions, but the woman seemed steady, as though she had done this many times before. The Apache woman, whose name Jake still didn't know, shifted slightly on the cot. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment, she simply stared up at the ceiling as if confused by her surroundings. Then her eyes found Jake, and they locked onto him with a look that was half uncertain, half fearful. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just a faint rasping noise. Jake stepped forward slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey, take it easy. You're safe now," he said gently, his voice soft but reassuring. "You're in a safe place." The Apache woman blinked, her confusion deepening. Her brow furrowed as if trying to understand what Jake was saying. But the words didn't seem to register. Then with great effort she lifted her hand, weakly reaching out toward him. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she wanted. He carefully took her hand in his, feeling how frail and weak she was. Her skin was hot to the touch, still burning with fever, and she trembled slightly. She closed her eyes again as if the simple effort of reaching out had drained her. Jake didn't know what to do. He had saved her life, but now he felt completely out of his depth. He wasn't trained to be a healer, and the woman's condition was beyond his understanding. But he couldn't just leave her now, not after everything he had done to bring her this far. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake murmured, his voice low and steady. "You're going to be okay." Just as he said those words, the woman who had helped them entered the room, carrying a small bowl of water and some fresh cloths. She walked over to the cot and knelt beside the Apache woman. Without speaking, she began gently wiping the woman's face with a damp cloth, her movements calm and practiced. The Apache woman didn't flinch or pull away. She simply lay there, her eyes closed, allowing the woman to care for her. Jake stood by, watching in silence. He didn't know what kind of customs or traditions the Apache followed, but there was something undeniably human about the way they treated each other in times of need. It made him realize more than ever how far apart the different worlds they came from truly were. After a few moments, the woman looked up at Jake. "She's still very weak," she said in a quiet voice, "but I think she'll make it. She just needs time." Jake nodded, grateful for the woman's help, but still unsure of what to do next. "I don't know anything about her or her people. Do you think she'll be okay here?" The woman glanced at the Apache woman, her face softening with sympathy. "She'll need care," she said, "but she's not from around here, that's for sure. She's Apache, and that means she's been through more than you can imagine. It's a wonder she made it as far as she did." Jake's stomach twisted at the thought of what the Apache woman must have endured. He had seen the scars on her body, the marks of someone who had fought to survive. But it wasn't just the physical wounds that weighed heavily on him. It was the emotional toll, the fear and pain that must have driven her to that desert in the first place. He couldn't even begin to understand what she had gone through. As the day went on, the Apache woman remained in a deep sleep. The fire in the hearth flickered softly, and the woman who had helped them continued her work, bringing in food and drink for both Jake and the injured woman. It was clear that this woman, whoever she was, had taken it upon herself to care for them without question. Jake was grateful, but he also felt like a stranger in a foreign place. He had no idea how to repay this woman, or what he was even supposed to do next. He hadn't planned for any of this. He had simply been trying to do the right thing when he found the Apache woman in the desert. But now that he had saved her life, he wasn't sure where to go from here. After some time, the woman who had been helping them came to sit with Jake by the fire. The room was quieter now, the only sound coming from the crackling flames. "You seem like a good man," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You did the right thing, bringing her here. I can see it in your eyes that you care." Jake didn't know how to respond. He was still processing everything that had happened, still unsure of what kind of future awaited them both. The woman's words, however, struck a chord with him. She had been right about one thing. He did care. He cared deeply about the Apache woman's safety, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure she was okay. "I don't know what to do now," Jake said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "She's not from here, and I'm not sure what will happen if her people find out I've helped her." The woman looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've already done more than most would have done," she said finally. "But you need to remember that you're not alone in this. We all have our struggles. We all come from different places, but that doesn't mean we can't help each other." Jake stared at the fire, the woman's words sinking in. He had always kept to himself, never getting too close to anyone, always moving from place to place. But now, with the Apache woman's life in his hands, he realized that maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to do more than just survive. He looked back at the woman who had helped them, a small but grateful smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." The woman gave him a gentle nod. "You're welcome. But remember, you can't do this alone. You have to trust in others too." For the first time since he had found the Apache woman, Jake felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of his journey. Maybe it was just the beginning. The days passed slowly in the small settlement. The Apache woman, whom Jake had rescued from the desert, was slowly regaining her strength, though she still had a long way to go. The fever had finally broken, and her feverish nights were replaced by quiet rest, though she remained weak. She could sit up now and drink small amounts of water, but there was no way of knowing how much longer it would take before she was fully recovered. Each day, Jake watched over her as she regained her strength, feeling a deep sense of responsibility. During this time, Jake had learned more about her. The woman's name was Nayeli, which in the language of her people meant the way to be loved or the path of love. Despite the language barrier, they were starting to communicate. She had told him her story in broken English, and through simple gestures they had begun to understand each other. Nayeli was from a small Apache tribe in the nearby mountains. She had been captured during an attack by settlers, and in the confusion she had managed to escape, though she had been severely injured and left behind in the desert. She didn't speak much about the details of her escape, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes when she spoke about it. Jake knew that it wasn't just the physical wounds that had hurt her, but the emotional scars as well. She had lost everything, the safety of her people, her family, her way of life. She had been left behind in the desert with no one to help her. But now, thanks to Jake, she was alive. Though her body was healing, it was clear that her spirit had been broken in ways that would take much longer to repair. As the days went on, Jake spent more time with her. He helped her as she regained her strength, bringing her food, water, and helping her stretch her limbs as she recovered. The woman who had first helped them, whose name was Sarah, would often visit, offering advice on how to care for Nayeli. Together they kept the fire burning in the small cabin and ensured Nayeli had the care she needed. The small community, which had once been so wary of the Apache woman, had now accepted her presence with a quiet understanding. Jake had learned to trust Sarah, and she had shared with him a few important things about life in the desert. She told him that survival out here required a certain kind of resilience, the kind that only the desert could teach. She spoke about how people had to band together if they were to face the harsh conditions of the land. There were times when the desert was unforgiving, and it was during those times that people had to rely on one another. Sarah, though she had lived here for years, was the type of person who believed in helping others, even if they were strangers. She was a reminder to Jake that kindness could be found in even the most unexpected places. One afternoon, after another long day of tending to Nayeli, Jake found himself sitting outside the small cabin, looking at the setting sun. The colors in the sky were vibrant, deep purples, oranges, and pinks, and for the first time in days, Jake felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he had done the right thing. He had brought her to safety, and he had given her a chance to live. But there was still one question that weighed heavily on his mind. What would happen when Nayeli was fully recovered? She had come from a world far different from his, and Jake had no idea what her life would look like now that she was here, in this small settlement. Would she be able to return to her tribe? Would she be safe with the settlers? Could they find a way to move forward in a world that had torn their lives apart? These questions hung in the air, unanswered. The world they lived in was a place of division and conflict, with settlers and indigenous tribes at odds. Even now in this small settlement, the tensions of the past lingered. Jake knew it would be hard for Nayeli to go back to her people, and even harder for her to live among the settlers. He had seen enough of the world to know that there would always be people who saw her as an enemy. But what else could he do? He had helped her, and now he had to let her make her own choices. Jake had always been a man of action, someone who stepped in when needed, but this time he knew the next step wasn't his to decide. It was Nayeli's choice. Over the next few days, as Nayeli's strength returned, the conversations between them grew more meaningful. She could now speak a little more English, and Jake, in return, learned a few words in her language. Slowly, their bond deepened. They shared stories of their lives, their cultures, and their struggles. Jake learned about the Apache way of life, how they respected the land, their customs, and their people. He also learned about the hardships they had faced, including the raids by settlers and the constant fight to keep their way of life alive. Nayeli, in turn, learned more about Jake. He told her of his life as a cowboy, of moving from town to town, and of the loneliness that came with never staying in one place. He didn't have many ties, but the people he met along the way often left an impression on him. He told her about his family, a distant memory, and how he had learned to survive in the desert. It wasn't long before Nayeli began to open up about her past more freely. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she told Jake about the time she had spent with her people before everything changed. She spoke of her family, of her father who had taught her the ways of the land, and of her mother who had shown her kindness and strength. She spoke of her tribe's connection to the earth and the rituals that marked the passage of time. Her words carried a sense of loss, but also strength. She had lost so much, but she had not given up. She had survived when most others would have perished in the harsh desert. She had fought to live, to hold on to whatever was left of her old life. And now she had a new chance, though she wasn't sure what it would look like. Jake listened to her with quiet attention, understanding more than he had before. He saw her not as an Apache woman or an enemy, but as a person, a human being just like him trying to survive in a world that didn't always make sense. They were more alike than he had ever imagined. As the days passed, the tension that had once filled the air between them began to fade. Nayeli had come to trust Jake, and he had come to respect her. They were two people who had found each other in the middle of the desert, at the mercy of a world that seemed determined to separate them. But they had managed to survive. And now they were beginning to forge a new path, one that was uncertain but full of possibilities. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars begin to dot the sky, Nayeli turned to Jake with a thoughtful expression on her face. "I don't know where I will go," she said softly, "but I know I cannot stay here forever." Jake nodded, understanding what she meant. He had known from the beginning that she would have to make her own way. He didn't know what the future held for her, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever path she chose, she had a strength that would carry her through. "I'll help you," Jake said quietly. "No matter where you go, I'll make sure you're not alone." Nayeli looked at him, her eyes soft but filled with gratitude. For a moment there was no divide between them, no barriers of race or background. They were simply two people who had shared something powerful, a bond built on survival, on kindness, and on a deep understanding that no matter how different their worlds had been, they had come together when it mattered most. The desert had been unforgiving, but it had also brought them together, and as the night grew darker and the stars shone brightly above, Jake and Nayeli sat in silence, knowing that whatever came next, they had each other's trust. It was enough for now.